Psychoanalysis, omnipotence and absolute. Omnipotence is a term made popular twice in psychoanalysis. First occasion was when Freud talked about narcissism. And when Freud talked about narcissism, the concept of omnipotence came up. After Freud, when Klein talked about the omnipotent good breast, the concept of omnipotence reappeared on the center stage. The concept of absolute appears more in philosophy, both Eastern and Western. In the Western philosophy, we see it in Hegel, we see it partly in Spinoza. We see it hidden in Kierkegaard. In the East, we see it in the Advaitic concept of enlightenment. We also see it in the Eastern cyclical philosophy and Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. Our discussion today will go into the clarification of the working of the mind in the area of the movement from desire to ordinary satisfaction to the quest of omnipotence and the quest of absolute, and how the concepts of desire, omnipotence, and absolute are related to each other, and what implications it has for pathogenesis and healing. If we investigate the relationship between desire, omnipotence, and absolute, the ordinary movement of desire is to satisfy the desire with occurrence of some events favorable to the satisfaction of desire. These events may involve human objects, it may not involve human objects. Nature of desire, however, is such that there is something called the infinity of desire. Desire cannot be satisfied by satisfying it once or a few times. It reoccurs and demands more and more intensity of satisfaction. Over a period of time, the law of diminishing returns sets in. However, that does not exhaust, satisfy, quench, or erase the desire. Ordinary desires aside, if we investigate desire more, we see universal quest of omnipotence that is present in everyone, along with pleasure, aggression, narcissism. We see omnipotence as also one of the fundamental elementals of the human mind. Object relations also. And obviously the five are interconnected, not exclusively elemental. The desire for omnipotence comes out if we honestly investigate enough ourselves or our patients. The context of omnipotence, however, is interesting. Omnipotence is a dualistic concept. It is a situation of having all that one can possibly have in a dualistic social situation. This is one movement of desire to be omnipotent, to have everything the world can offer. It is in one way a social concept. There is a second movement of desire, which is more monoistic, non-dualistic, and that is a movement into the ecstasy inside of us. And this often comes with an oceanic experience where it is a object-free state. Primary narcissism is a combination of both. That ecstasy of the oceanic phase and occasionally an omnipotence that sets in. Just as the object life is beginning. The absolute is somewhat different. It is the movement of desire towards something that cannot be completely articulated and be made known. It is something that can be posited as a concept without a positive articulation of it. It is an entity that can be conceptualized, but the entity cannot be articulated or touched or reached by the cognitive function. Absolute is by definition, not only by definition, the definition comes out of our own inner journey. And it is not an artificial definition, it is a discovery of a real entity that we are capturing in this world. And the absolute is the goal of desire. And this absolute is something more than ordinary pleasure, omnipotence, and ecstasy. They can be components of it, but it is something more than it. it also has a component of oneness with existence. Often one feels as though one has been shred off from a massive immensity, and there is an alienation of a very fundamental kind. Not a social alienation, a pre-personality alienation, so to say. It's a spiritual alienation. And the absolute is something more than ordinary pleasure, omnipotence, the ecstasy of oceanic feeling, and all the feelings associated with re-merging into that infinite immensity. And even this articulation falls short of the absolute, it is something more. And this then is the quest of desire. Obviously, in the human form, this cannot be experienced. Nor can omnipotence be experienced in reality. Nor can ecstasy be perpetuated in reality. Desire also creates a state by combination of ordinary pleasures, omnipotence, and ecstasy, which we never had. And even this state imagined by desire falls short of the absolute. It is in the distance between events, omnipotence, and ecstasy and the absolute. It falls in between. It doesn't reach the absolute. It cannot. Lacan says, we are in quest of that which we never had. And this is something that desire creates. But even that quest that Lacan talks about falls short of the absolute. The final goal of desire is absolute, not even the goal Lacan talks about. If we try to differentiate omnipotence and absolute, if omnipotence gives us the sense of infinity, infinite power, infinite goodness, infinite love, infinite relationships, infinite prosperity, that still becomes more of a social imagination. With infinity, of course, but yet a social imagination. If one were to consolidate all of it and make a black hole kind of an entity, a solid infinite infinity, and add to it certain more things which we cannot articulate completely, that would become the absolute. Omnipotence is far short of the absolute. The absolute is beyond language, beyond the cognitive function. Often in the realm of ordinary desire, we see the realm of ordinary desire is almost like a fungible currency market, where if the desire for power is not satisfied, you can satisfy the sense pleasure desire. If the desire for emotions is not satisfied, you can satisfy more of the knowledge or the spiritual desire. And somehow, if you don't have enough of one, but you have more of the other, on the whole, the system accepts it, moves forward. There's a kind of a fungibility in the desire market. It seems as though, on the whole, the system has to have some quantum of desire satisfaction and move ahead. And there the concept comes, is it that even in the ordinary desire, we are moving towards a half absolute, and there are various ways of moving towards the half absolute? That's not really a concept that does justice to the real meaning of absolute. So we can't call it half absolute. You can call it a micro absolute in one sense, but not a half absolute. Exploring now the omnipotence part, it is something underappreciated, underused in psychoanalysis and therapy. In real social life, we see how important the desire of omnipotence is to us. And if we can't be omnipotent, how we experience omnipotence by identification with celebrities and leaders. And the quest of omnipotence, if it is frustrated, even there, allegiance to an ideology is invented. And we also see the seduction of leaders when they are able to evoke the transfer of omnipotence. We see that in India right now, we see it in many other countries also. The transfers of omnipotence. In India, possibly for the right reasons, constructive reasons. In other countries, the South American countries, more for destructive reasons. Self-destruction I'm referring to. In India, of course, the transfer of omnipotence is very constructive and positive. Omnipotence, frustrated deeply, is a very important part of pathology, especially personality disorders. The open split and the projection of omnipotence, both positive and negative, are very common parts of most personality disorders. Omnipotence as a inspiring and a motivating factor is also a very important factor in healthy individuals. And the quest of omnipotence keeps individuals and societies going. The quest may come in a very petty form. I have and you don't have. I know and you don't know. Or the quest can come in more sublimated, sublime forms of conquering pain, conquering disease, conquering limitations of human nature. But the quest of omnipotence keeps individuals and societies going. And the quest of absolute is more than a quest of omnipotence, it's a spiritual quest. Absolute is beyond human experience. It's also beyond the cognitive function. What Lacan said, there is a search of what we never had, which we believe we once had, that also falls short of the absolute. Even though what Lacan says cannot be defined completely, but even that falls short of the absolute. Absolute is beyond the best desire can construct. What happens then to this quest? They search for omnipotence, partial satisfaction, and discontent, very natural to the human existence. Existentialism, in a way, is a result of utter failure to realize omnipotence, the quest of which cannot be given up. So if the desire for omnipotence is very strong, everything is staked on that desire, and the desire results in utter failure, it leads to a situation of the crisis of existentialism. Existentialism as an ism from a psychological standpoint emerges in this matrix of utter failure of a desire for omnipotence on which everything is staked, everything is focused, and nothing else will do. In spirituality, the same quest for omnipotence appears. The difference is in existentialism, one accepts the utter failure and helplessness in one's quest of omnipotence. In spirituality, there is hope. Hope of enlightenment, through which either omnipotence and absolute can be satisfied, or the desire for them is deactivated and one is free. Aurobindo talks about the difference between it, indirectly, not directly. One of the lines in Savitri is, all that the world can give is too small and can't quench the spirit's sacred thirst. Can't quench or can't satisfy, I'm not sure. Please check it. Here, Sri Aurobindo talks about the inadequacy of omnipotence. Even if one were to be omnipotent, the spirit's sacred thirst still can't be quenched. And we are hardwired for a surge of omnipotence and absolute. It is the fuel of conscious evolution of human race. A fuel continuously supplied to us by nature. Human civilization is largely powered by this fuel. And the quest of omnipotence in everyday life is distinctly seen in the early part of childhood, worship of oneself as omnipotent, then worship of parents as omnipotent, then worship of celebrities and leaders as omnipotent, and then worship of ideologies, religions, and gods as omnipotent. Human creations giving form to omnipotence, in fact, are all defective, and the meaning of the word omnipotence is never fully rendered into any specific manifestation exhaustively by any human being. All renditions of omnipotence into anything specific are partial. And there is then this, just as you have the myth of the Sisyphus, there is a search of the Sisyphus. The search of the Sisyphus for omnipotence and absolute. And like in the myth of Sisyphus, this search cannot be fulfilled. It is so deep that it cannot be given up. One parallel is a statement by Rousseau. Rousseau used to say, when reason turns against man, man will turn against reason. And this has to do with when reason turns against some affective quest, some pleasure quest, or the quest for omnipotence and absolute, man turns against those reasons. We see the suspension of reason turning against what reason says in all social movements where there is seduction of a leader or ideology, and there is a projection of omnipotence on the leader or ideology, and the society experiences the ecstasy of omnipotence and cannot give up the experience of omnipotence by identification. It is so intoxicating. It cannot be fought by reason. It is too strong for reason to triumph over it. The quest of omnipotence and absolute also comes out in the spiritual books. In the Veda, the goal of the human enterprise is to make heaven and earth equal and one. And this goal follows from the principle of the universe, that this universe has been so created that it will have beings in quest of the omnipotence and absolute. Coming to the absolute, shades of the absolute, micro encounters with the absolute come out in certain situations. One, the search for an anchor. Often we find this search when disintegration or fragmentation anxieties are evoked. The desire for merger, the urge to merge. In the movement from terror to omnipotence to absolute, to overcome terror. When all that we want we have and the omnipotence is not fulfilling, the search for the absolute begins. The absolute is like an answer without a question. We cannot formulate a comprehensive question to which it is an answer, but we know it is the answer. Omnipotence is the destination of the human world, ordinarily speaking, but it is not the final destination. Absolute is the final destination, but few can conceptualize this final destination. So most people mistakenly believe omnipotence is the final destination, which is not. Absolute is the final destination. What are the implications for therapy? In therapy, it takes some skill, but relatively speaking, easy to identify omnipotence. It has to be identified, interpreted, and managed, which requires quite a long work. Honesty on part of the patient, sincerity on the part of the patient. Fulfillment has to be discussed before we can go to the concept of absolute, which by definition, not only by definition, by reality, is beyond the cognitive function, beyond the reach of the cognitive function. It's not beyond the cognitive function, but beyond the reach of the cognitive function if it comes to exhaustive elaboration of the concept. It's a concept we can define by partial negation and partial ignorance. We cannot have an exhaustive positive elaboration of the concept. So that from omnipotence one can move to fulfillment and then to the concept of absolute. But this would be possible only in long-term sincere classical psychoanalysis of 3 days or 5 days a week. It cannot be done in a process which is healing focused or short-term focused. This is more likely to come up if you have an intellectual in therapy or mature trainee in therapy. The quest for omnipotence, the frustration and the intense effects coming from the frustration are very important to many personality disorders, especially personality, sorry, in many disorders, especially personality disorders. And it calls for mourning. And after the elaboration of it, catharsis of affect and mourning, the idea of a good life, goals, and everyday can be designed. Art, spirituality, holistic healing, and living exploration, all of this help if they can be used based upon the orientation of the therapist and the patient and the capability of both and the willingness of both, of course. And the spiritual journey, if the patient is on and the therapist is capable of engaging in that discourse, that helps in integrating the elements into therapy, the element of desire, of omnipotence, of frustration, of reality acceptance, the concept of absolute, holistic journey of life, and finally a spiritual journey. Anchoring as a cohering anchor for the idea of a good life. Of course, these are not the only elements of therapy. These are only two. Omnipotence and absolute are only two of the many elements which come up in therapy. But focused on these two elements, so much can be said. It is a deep and a difficult conceptual journey. If you have any questions, write to me at hvindia@gmail.com. Thank you.